Sometimes it's the habits and the patterns that we've built up around ourselves to protect ourselves that are preventing us from getting to the next phase of our journey. Earlier this year, I was going through a really challenging time. Emotionally, I was not in a great place because of some real eye-opening things that had been revealed in a personal relationship of mine. Physically, I was really sick and I just couldn't figure out what the root cause of the issues were. Mentally and spiritually, I felt very disconnected from myself, and I just found myself one day really questioning and wondering, like, why do all of these things keep on happening? If you're watching this video, you've gone through some of these similar experiences yourself, or you can relate in some way. So in today's video, I want to share with you 5 things that have completely shifted my life over the last year. Number 1 is listening to my gut more. Historically, it's been really easy for me to kind of talk myself out of things or stick around in certain dynamics, situations, relationships far longer than I should have, giving things way more chances than they deserve. And many times, most of the time, a lot of the time, it turned into a lot of self-sacrificing, and I was just constantly feeling drained by giving what I didn't actually have to give. I did that so much and for such a long time that it became really easy for me to talk myself out of whatever it is that I was feeling, any kind of hesitations that I might have had about a particular situation. And it just kind of became a habit for me to ignore those little feelings and subtle signs that you recognize when something might be nearing the end or might just not really serve you as much as you had hoped or had thought that it was. And so in this last year, I've really started listening to my gut more and paying attention to those little feelings, those little hints that you do start getting that, you know, oftentimes you kind of look back on and you're like, oh, well, I knew that was going to happen, or I had a feeling that XYZ. And so this year I've really made it a priority to start paying attention to those things way more than I used to. And I've noticed this last year that paying closer attention to those signs of like when something feels a little bit off or just not right anymore, it's really allowed me to become more connected to myself and my own intuition. I feel a lot more connected, and like I feel like I can recognize that inner voice a lot easier than I used to, where I don't doubt myself anymore when I do get a feeling about something the way that I had, you know, in the past. And so what this has done is that it's saved me so much more time and energy, and it has allowed me to give myself permission to step away from the things that don't actually serve me way faster than I used to. It's allowed me to get into better alignment with my inner self and to be in better touch with my inner guide, which is something that we all have. It's just most of the time we just don't make it a point to really start connecting to that part of ourselves that knows more than our consciousness sometimes does, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel like some of you have to understand what I'm trying to get at here. So with all of this kind of just listening to my gut more, it's allowed me to better recognize and avoid falling back onto certain patterns and habits that had previously been keeping me stuck in a pattern that I was wishing to grow out of. So just being able to better recognize like, okay, this kind of feels familiar. What about this feels familiar? And being able to recognize that something might just not be the right thing for me, if that makes sense. The second thing that really shifted my life this year is cultivating and leaning into balanced relationships. And here I want to like put asterisks and bold and underline the word balanced. I'm naturally a giver, and it was really common for me to overgive or rationalize or excuse or just give more chances than were warranted in a lot of relationships and dynamics that had been in my life over the course of the last like 10, 15 years or so. And so what happened with that is that it became a habit for me to make myself available for others at my own expense. it was constantly draining my energy, and I just couldn't figure out why I was just so drained all the time. So this year, because I was just really not in a great place, like at the start of this year, and I just was feeling so off in so many different levels, I really started paying attention to the relationships that I had in my life at the time, and I noticed some imbalances for sure. I really took the time to kind of analyze what dynamics in my life were starting to feel like they were draining more than giving. So like I said, I really started paying close attention to the energy exchange aspect of my relationships. And of course, there are going to be times where one person in a relationship is giving more than the other, regardless of the type of relationship. It could be romantic, friendship, family, all of those things. There is that dance of going back and forth, of give and take, but in general, it should be a pretty fair and even exchange where both people in the dynamic are having their needs met. But that's not something that I really started paying a closer attention to until earlier this year, because I was in a place where I had to. And so with that in mind, with these realizations in mind, I started to pull my energy back in certain situations. And what I found is that it did one of two things. It either, that relationship either dwindled away and it fizzled, which of course is a sign in itself, or what it did is it created the space in that relationship for that other person to come in as they were, which at the end of the day actually made the relationship a lot more authentic, because it allowed both of us to come from a space that we were able to inhabit in a more balanced way. And at first it was a little scary and uncomfortable, especially being an overgiver or just being someone who tends to show their love in that way of acts of service or quality time, things like that. It did feel scary at first to pull my energy back in, but I now feel so much more fulfilled in the relationships that I do have around me, and I feel so much more at peace, and I feel so much more energized when I spend time with the people that are close to me in my life, that it was so worth it to really take stock and evaluate the relationships that I had in my life, and kind of allow the ones that weren't giving to me, that weren't, how do I say that without sounding like a jerk? Yeah, it just made all of my relationships way better. And in some cases, like I said, some of those relationships fizzled, and I've learned how to be okay with that. Just reaffirming to myself that not everyone is meant to be in your life long term. Not everyone is meant to be in your life in that specific way forever. Relationships evolve over time, and people come in and out of your life. They have their own things going on too. And so anyway, yeah, cultivating and leaning more into balanced relationships was a huge game changer for me, for my mental health, and for my energy as a whole this year. The third real life-changing thing this year was creating the intention to remind myself over and over that everyone is on their own journey, everyone is on their own path, everyone is doing what they feel is best for them. Taking it back to point number 2 that I was just talking about, being a giver or an overgiver or a people pleaser, if that resonates with you, is being in that state allows you to take things a lot more personal. It puts you into this energetic state of being more sensitive to perceived wrongs or rejections, and then it leads to sometimes having your feelings hurt when they don't necessarily need to be. So what I realized through this process, that what I was actually doing is I was giving all my power away by allowing things to affect me like that. So I just got into the habit of reminding myself that everyone is doing what is best for them, and it's not personal. This can apply to a friend that you feel like has been ignoring you, or a coworker getting on your nerves, or a rude driver on the road. Rarely is it ever personal. And taking this approach has allowed me to find grace and forgiveness and compassion so much more easily than it used to be. And definitely not to say that I was always taking things personal or, always getting upset with people for these stories that I created in my head. That is definitely not the case. That's not who I am or who I've ever been, but more so just like it's a shift in the lens that I was taking information in through. In that way, like I kind of started taking it as data, as information, as facts to kind of orient myself around whatever reality I was in at the time. Especially as it relates to the last point that I was just talking about, interpersonal relationships and how much impact they can have in your day-to-day life. So in certain interactions, like just having this framework in mind of everyone is doing what is best for them, it's not personal, allowed me to remain a lot more grounded and centered in certain situations, and for things to not stick with me as long as they used to. The fourth big thing was retraining my mind to recognize long-term progress and not hyper-focusing so much on short-term failures or shortcomings that I might be perceiving at the time. It is super important to learn from those little day-to-day things of like, what could I have done better here, or what can I change for the next time so that I don't find myself in that particular situation. And making those little changes over time has a huge impact further down the road. But again, because of how I was feeling at the time, earlier this year, starting off the year, I just found myself getting really hard and down and kind of like beating myself up for all of these like little failures that I thought that I was failing at the time. So I was nitpicking and hyper-focusing on the things that I really shouldn't have instead of looking at the big picture. And so when I realized what I was doing, I started retraining myself to start noticing when I was going down that way of thinking, of hyper-focusing and like that negative spiral loop that I'm sure that you can relate to also. I started training myself to recognize when that was happening, and I would then take it as an opportunity to create a list either in my head or I would write it down. Writing it down for me has always been so much more powerful and eye-opening than just, kind of like listing things out in my head, but I'm just like a paper person. So as I've practiced this year, what I've noticed is not only is it now easier for me to recognize when it's happening and to change those thought patterns over time, but it's also made me a lot more resilient, where I'm not so hard on myself if I slip up or make a mistake on something, and things just don't affect me as greatly or for as long as they used to. And honestly, it's made me feel a lot more powerful and confident in myself, and it's really allowed me to stay connected to those long-term goals a lot easier than it was before. Number 5 is giving myself permission to not have it all figured out. I don't know if it's because I'm a perfectionist, which I don't really think that I'm a perfectionist, but over the course of my life, like there's been so many things that I've put off starting because I felt like I didn't have it all figured out. I've had this false narrative in my head that I have to have all of my ducks in a row, all of the research done, all of the lists and the Excel spreadsheets and all of that done before I can even give myself permission to start on something. And it's simply not true, at least for me. I do know some people that thrive on having all of these plans and can execute the plan perfectly, but that has just never been me. I've always kind of struggled with that, and I've always kind of used it more as a crutch or as a way to procrastinate actually starting. And so I kind of took a step back and I realized that this was a pretty common theme in multiple areas of my life, like making certain dietary changes or incorporating a new fitness routine into my schedule. And especially when it came down to more creative and self-starting aspects of my career, it was really easy for me to put things off because I didn't have everything figured out. But what I, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, it was just a pattern to keep me nice and comfortable. There's always going to be that resistance to pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. There's going to be that resistance to going out and being vulnerable with certain pursuits or new hobbies or just learning something new, going back to school, getting your degree. It's a form of keeping yourself safe in a way, and keeping yourself comfortable, because when you're comfortable, you are familiar with everything that's around you. And more than anything, I feel like that's what our brains and, our human nature wants, is to be safe, even if being safe means that you are stuck in a place that you don't necessarily want to be forever. And even though I've been aware of it for many, many years, that growth does not happen when we're in our comfort zone, this last year I really made the commitment to myself to just push myself out of that and just to just give it a shot and just start chipping away little by little. So now when I have a new idea or a new interest, or I want to try something new, I just start. Like I pause right where that fork in the road in my head, where I go from, I could either take this road of just starting, or I could take this more tempting road of researching and planning and making pretty tables in my planner and all of these different things. And all of that stuff has a time and a place, but what I've really pushed myself this year to do is to just start. Take this road over here and just start. And what I've learned is that I will figure it out along the way. So I now resist the urge to do a million hours of research, and I just trust that things will unfold naturally. And there's been a couple little experiments with myself that I've done over this last year where I'm just like, okay, I'm just gonna start and see what happens. And I've realized that actually taking that approach saves me a lot of hours on research, because most of the time, all of that research that I was doing before starting something wasn't even being put to use. It was all of the stuff that I was learning along the way, like that tangible real world experience that was way more valuable to me than anything that I might have been researching or learning from the internet or watching videos or talking to people or what have you. And like I said, all of that stuff has a time and the place, but what has worked for me is just starting. So even though the start of this year was pretty rough, I'm super grateful for it at this point, because it forced me to take a step back and evaluate all of the patterns and the habits that weren't serving me and that were just there to keep me comfortable in the familiar. Let me know if any of this resonates with you, if you can relate to any of these things that I've mentioned, and let me know in the comments below too what's worked for you to kind of get you out of any ruts or patterns that you've been trying to break. Any practices that you have that you've found super helpful, I would love to connect with you. Let's share this information with each other. We're all in this together. And if you found this video helpful, this video that I'm going to link somewhere here is my 10 simple habits that I've used to completely transform my mental health. These are things that I do on a daily and a weekly basis without fail, and it's really helped me so much, so I want to share that with you too. Thank you so much for watching this video today. I will see you in the next one.